to the city of Basra. Here we are in Habila.
I was so eager to get you on stage that I forgot that we had this clip of you.
Was I meant to not see it?
Sorry?
Was I meant to not see it?
No. You were meant to see it. We see you with the previous mayor of Amsterdam for just a little bit.
I was just going to say,
what was the
I
occasion?
mentioned Amsterdam.
Yeah, what was the occasion there?
I can't remember.
Well, I can tell why, because you've been everywhere. What do you think when you see this 2-minute clip of yourself?
I think there's a lot of bad hair.
Well, at least you still have hair. I mean,
That's true. That's true. I get excited. I like it. You know, I've really loved everything I've done, and it's funny to watch this. You know, this sort of compilation. A lot of it is out of date, by the way. But I really enjoyed seeing Maduro there.
Right. I was thinking of him.
For much longer, Mr. Maduro. Hopefully. Yeah.
We'll get to all that. I want to start off, and it's really cheesy, but I love it, with a few dilemmas. Really brief ones. Iran or England?
You mean a rapid fire questions?
Yes.
Yowza. Do I like them better? What's the question? Which one do I feel
The question
more
is, pick one.
Oh, man. You know, you said you were going to be ruthless and empathetic.
No, I said you were.
I think you should be empathetic tonight.
Okay,
no.
okay.
Iran
After these dilemmas,
London?
I will be.
Both.
Remain or leave?
Oh, come on. Remain.
The House of Commons or Congress?
Neither. Both dysfunctional.
The only right answer. A studio or a conflict zone?
Conflict zone.
Your son's first birthday party or breaking news?
My son's first birthday party.
Your son's first birthday party or breaking news?
I was there on his first birthday party. It was the second one that I had to delay.
Okay.
But I did it. He didn't know he was only
right.
2.
He's only 2.
So I brought the birthday party up a little bit.
Right. He's 17 now, right?
18. Nearly 19.
Okay.
Yeah.
We'll let you. I'll stick the. Well,
Hang
no.
on, he's just showed me a way of getting an answer.
Amsterdam or Rotterdam?
Amsterdam.
Good. Okay.
I'm sure Rotterdam is really nice too, but I just haven't been there. And The Hague. I know The Hague very well.
Every city is beautiful. Okay. I want to really start off with a famous quote from Horace Greeley, who was a famous newspaper editor, the New York Tribune, later a congressman from New York, and he famously said, "Journalism will kill you, but it will keep you alive while you're at it." The underlying premise of that being, think twice before you go into journalism. You and I have the best job in the world. You've done it for much longer time than I have.
Must you keep reminding me? I was 17 when I saw her.
It's not visible. It's not visible. If you could give the strongest plea possible for the importance of journalism in this day and age particular, what would it be?
That it matters almost more than any other thing, because a true, free and independent press that covers the world and holds people accountable without fear nor favor, in other words, without taking a position except the position of the truth, is, I think, the most vital pillar of civil society and of democracy. And I really do believe that, and partly because that's what I do, and I believe it has a huge impact, our profession, but also because I have watched in emerging societies like Iran, you mentioned. In 1998, there was a brief moment of reform in Iran, and a guy with a turban, Mohammad Khatami, became president, but he was unlike all the others, and he actually started to try to put more stock in some of these reform things that people would want. And I saw in Iran, the reform movement was led by journalists. It was journalists who led the reform movement. And I've seen that in many other places. In other words, journalists who are committed to the truth, to progressive politics, to freedom, have a huge role to play in society. And I think you can see right now in the United States or in Britain, in France, in many of the countries that have faced, which I think is an existential threat that we face right now, this idea of interference in our democracies, plus the questioning of the truth, I think journalism is even more important today than it has been in my lifetime.
The challenge is bigger than ever before.
I think so.
I talked about the scene for tonight. Many people get to ask questions, so we'll end with this about fake news and the truth, and also the war on journalism in the sense that Donald Trump is performing in the US. But we'll also talk about your career, and we'll start with your life and how your career got started. If you had not become a journalist, what would you be doing right now?
Well, I've been having some chats before we came on stage, and we were talking about kids and what kids and young adults go through, and how to motivate them, and how to keep them, interested in forging their own way in life. Because we all live in a pretty privileged environment, and it's quite hard. I think certainly as generations go on, they feel more and more privileged, more and more entitled, maybe less and less motivated. I think one of the greatest gifts that any parent can give their child is the gift of motivation and incentive and desire and curiosity. And so just to say that I was lucky to grow up like that. I was a very, very curious child. I remember when I was a little girl, I was nosy, I call it curious. I was an early journalist. I would sit in the living room when my parents had guests and sit behind the sofa so I could always listen to all the conversations. And sometimes I would sit under the dinner table in these round tables with tablecloths that went all the way down to the bottom so nobody could see me, so I could listen to what was going on. I was always really, really curious. But I went to school and I wanted to be a doctor, because I thought that's what girls can be. Girls can be teachers, girls can be doctors, girls can be,
Is that also how you were brought up,
No,
progressively?
Progressively, yes, but very much so. But anyway, long story short, and this also comes back to kids and young people, failure is an incredibly important and indispensable ingredient in life. And I failed very big. I failed my A-levels. I didn't get the right grades to go to medical school. And I was very, very upset about it, and I felt I was sort of in the wilderness for a while. And at the same time, in my personal life and in my country, there was a revolution. So I was
you were born in London,
yes,
but you grew up
in
until
Iran.
you were 11 in Iran. Your father?
Yeah, is Iranian, my mother English, but we grew up in Iran. And so this is a really long way of saying that circumstances led me away from what I thought I was going to do to what I ended up doing. When I was old enough to see what was going on the streets in Iran. When I went out of Iran during the uprising and during the revolution, I could see how newspapers and television and still photos were depicting what was happening in my country. And I thought, wow, that's really interesting. I mean, apart from the fact that it completely upended our country, my life, my parents, and everything else, I was also fascinated by it. And I wanted to tell those stories, those big stories, to the world. And that's when I thought, oh, journalism. And then I went to the United States, and I went to university and studied journalism, and became a journalist.
Back to Iran briefly. What kind of family was it? Was it a privileged family? I know your father worked as an airline executive.
Yeah, here's the thing. Yes, I mean, Iran, if you look at the demographics, the statistics, there was a very small middle and upper class and a very large, that's why we had a revolution. And I was part of the 1%. And, but I wouldn't say I lived a very rich life. My father wasn't rich, but we were comfortable. I was able to go to school. I was able to have hobbies after school. Friends. I mean, we traveled once a year to England for my mother's family, so summers were in England. So it was privileged, but it wasn't over the top. Yeah.
And in '79, when the Iran Revolution happened, your family had to flee.
Well, again, they stayed precisely because they didn't have a whole load of wealth outside, that they had moved outside. They didn't have that wealth, and therefore they didn't move it outside. So they stayed. And I left in 1979 to go to university, and they stayed. I had two younger sisters who were in school in Iran, and who tell me amazing stories about how, it was actually a French-Persian lycée. And they tell me these amazing stories about how, from one day to the next, They went to school, and all of a sudden the girls had to wear scarves, hijabs to cover their hair, and all of a sudden their textbooks had all these pages ripped out of them, and everything changed on a dime. And so it was a pretty crazy experience. And as we all know, the Iranian Revolution affected the rest of the world, and we're still living the results of the first Islamic Revolution.
Yeah, I was going to say, because you had the hostage situation at the American embassy in Tehran. That was 444 days. That was the first taste America got of Islamic fundamentalism, in a way. So it's a key year for the US as well.
Yeah, it really is, and personally, I was sort of caught up in it a little bit when I went to university in the States, because that was by the time I got there, it was 1980, I think, and the hostages were there, and they still hadn't come out, and there was a lot of hostility on campus. I didn't hide that I was Iranian, but it was not pleasant. And I never particularly got aggressed myself, but other people did. I mean, I remember at university there were some Hispanic students, for instance, who others mistook for Iranians and threw stones and things like that. It wasn't pleasant. And there were all sorts of chants, bomb, 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 bomb Iran, all that kind of stuff. And you just had to figure out how to navigate through this minefield. And so I did. But I mean, all of this is incredibly vital to my education and my growth and to how I am as a journalist.
Has your background, being half Iranian, has that? Do you have the sense that you always got more, or at times were scrutinized more than other reporters?
Well, I think I had probably the immigrant experience plus. So I wasn't just an immigrant/refugee to America, but I was one from a country that they didn't like. Ragheads, terrorists, towel heads, that whole stuff. And because it was such a sensitive time, I do remember, and I think if you ask any immigrant or any refugee, any new citizen to a country, you will hear everyone saying they feel they have to work double, triple, 10 times
and you
as
felt
hard.
the same.
Absolutely. I felt not only did I have to prove myself in my profession, but I had to prove that I was a good Iranian, that I was, not a terrorist, that I was normal.
And did that ever end? That feeling that you had to? Or
Yes.
does it come back during certain interviews?
It does. It comes back at certain high anxiety moments and terrorist attacks and things like that. But not really. I think people know me well enough now. But it is something that definitely I was very aware of in the back of my mind, not in the forefront the whole time.
But if you would be interviewing Rouhani, for instance, as you did, there'll always be this fringe, I guess, the right-wing press saying you've been too kind on him, which is probably because you're Iranian.
Yes,
that's
people do say that, but most normal people know that I'm not kind to anybody. So
those who are familiar with your career.
So and I've held the Iranian presidents to account. Probably, I mean, the reverse is true. Probably even more so than maybe somebody else would, because I want to make sure that I'm not
compensating.
Compensating, exactly.
Right. Many of these interviews, the people, they start out, friendly and laughing, and then how often do they leave, taking off their microphone? And
very rarely.
Really?
I've had one, and it was, one of the worst leaders in my lifetime, and that was the Iranian president Ahmadinejad, who was really, really bad. And he did some very bad things and made Iran a pariah from 2005 until 2013 when he was voted out. And of course, he came after a reform president, Khatami, who started to make Iran more part of the community of nations. And then Ahmadinejad came with his aggressive behavior about the nuclear program. And I got that first interview whereby he told me several months after his election that he was going to go very aggressive into the nuclear program. Of course, they never said nuclear weapons. And as we know, Iran did not produce nuclear weapons. But they had a nuclear program that the West, including your country and everybody's countries, wanted not to happen. But Ahmadinejad was just a pariah and a Holocaust denier. And everything...
Wasn't that what pissed him off mostly? Was it one particular question about the Holocaust, or just the interview as a whole?
In general. But you know, I got his first interview, and then I was hoping to get I got several interviews with him. But once, he just came in, sat for one question, ripped his mic off, and went. And, you know, that was a problem because we had been promoting it and we'd done a lot of, you know, we'd spent a lot of money, we'd got a lot of crews.
But then there was one particular question that made him leave.
No, it wasn't. He just arrived and said, I'm not going to talk to you.
Okay.
He literally arrived and said, I don't want to talk to you.
Really?
And I said, but...
You're here.
Yeah. So he literally sat down. This is what a son of a, you know what he was.
Right.
He sat down, he answered one question, and he got up and left. Unbelievable. I mean, what kind of behavior is that? So that's why I had to ask.
I'm glad, yeah.
Second, you know, Rouhani, I wanted him on the record on the Holocaust. Right. Do you accept that this terrible thing happened?
What was the answer?
Yes. And it was he said yes, and he said it was, you know, a crime. He described it exactly how you would expect it.
Big news.
It was huge news. But then, and this is what's so crazy about some of this stuff, then I got all caught up in sort of the hate on Iran group no matter what. And the Wall Street Journal and I think some Israeli newspapers basically accused me, I think this is how it went, of mistranslating and saying that he never mentioned the Holocaust. Of course, it's not true. But I mean, that's how and that's how difficult sometimes is to actually get to the truth, because what we find is that there's so much politics around everything. Nobody wanted to hear an Iranian president actually come out and deny.
Right, it would ruin the cliché image we have of him. Back to your career. You began in journalism, or you began with CNN, I believe, in '83. You were 25 years old. How does a 25-year-old?
Thanks again.
No. Sorry. From now on, we'll pretend we're the same age. So it's 2003. You begin with CNN. No, okay. So it was '83. How does a 25-year-old end up with CNN after just leaving journalism school?
To be frank, I was a bit. You know, I was a late student. I mean, there were people who were at CNN at that time who were much younger than me because, you know, CNN was a startup. Ted Turner did this amazing thing when he created CNN. In 1980, it went on the air. And I don't know how many people know or recall or know this bit of history, but he literally, you know, sort of beat the system to create CNN. And nobody believed that it would work. And it was called Chicken Noodle News for a long time. And people thought it wouldn't survive, and that who on earth in their right minds wanted news 24/7? News on demand? Anyway, he was obviously ahead of his time. So what happened was, it was a startup, and he didn't have a huge amount of money to pay people the kind of wages that they would have liked to have been paid at the networks or whatever. So the people who came in to actually be the foot soldiers of this new experiment were university graduates. Not even graduate school graduates, college graduates who decided, you know what, there's this thing, and we're going to get our grad school experience on the job. And we're going to go there, and we're going to learn about how television and this and that, and then we're going to go off to the big leagues. So
that was also the philosophy, not just out of necessity.
It was out of necessity.
Okay.
Yeah. But also, you know, it's a startup, and now we know if you go to Silicon Valley, all the startups are populated by young people, right? Young geniuses. In this case, young people who didn't want to go to grad school and wanted to get a job. And that's what happened. And I joined about 3 years later in 1983. So that is 35 and a half, nearly years ago.
Now you're doing it yourself.
Yes, I am. Because I'm proud. Now I'm proud. Because there are not many people who are still there all these years later. I think I'm one of about 3 or 4. And I think there are about 2.
On screen, I don't. You
on
must
screen
be,
there's nobody. But behind the screen, no, there is one. Richard Roth. He's
the UN correspondent, right?
Yep, and he's great. He was one of my first friends at CNN. But it was an amazing experience, and I would wish this experience on any young person coming out of university, having a dream, and finding a job in the area that they want, and not getting very well paid. I was paid less than $10,000 a year for my starting salary, less than $10,000 a year, which even in Atlanta in 1983 was not a lot of money.
That changed, right?
Not much. But by the way, now that you mention it, it did change dramatically. And guess what? I'm even proud of that.
You deserve it.
No, it's not about deserving. It's about being paid fairly compared to men of my stature. Yep. So when I used to be embarrassed when people said that to me, now I own it.
Good.
Yep.
Good for you. This obviously... Anyway, we spoke at dinner briefly. Yeah, you got me off my feet there.
Did I? Go back to it. It's
yeah,
okay.
I know. We spoke at Tracy's house during this little dinner event, and you said something about Ted Turner's philosophy and about his ideas about international journalism.
Yeah.
Talk about that, because it's interesting.
I will. And so now we all live in a sort of a society or a culture. In all of our countries, there are little pockets of I hate foreigners. Right? They just are. And it's a political problem right now. And again, it's not connected to the truth. It's connected to lies and it's connected to lies about people. Ted Turner, when he created CNN, several years later, he created CNN International. And his philosophy was that we needed to be able to show Americans and show the world that we could reach out our hands and have a link between, in his case, America and the rest of the world. That there was no such thing as foreign, but it was international. And I said at the dinner that I had always wanted to be a foreign correspondent. That's a great title, foreign correspondent. That's the word. Until I got there, CNN was a foreign, you could be a foreign correspondent. And then Ted Turner banned the word foreign. We cannot say foreign on our air. We say international instead of foreign. And at the time, we thought it was a real inconvenience and it was just rubbish. But now, and shortly thereafter actually, we thought, well, this is amazing. I mean, here is this guy who understands a thing or two about the world and how to build bridges and how to stretch out his hand to others. And I really feel that the thing that I enjoy most about this job is telling the story of the other and being open to the story of the other, and not just through my prism or anybody's prism. So I think Ted Turner was most definitely on all aspects ahead of his time. Obviously in the area of media revolution, as you know, everything since is a copy, even social media. I mean, it's all about on demand, and he started that. He was ahead of his time on the issue of reaching out. He was ahead of his time on climate and the environment. He was the first mega private citizen to buy up huge tracts of land in the United States and also in Argentina and places like that for the sole purpose of conserving and not allowing them to be built on, and reintroducing depleted species and other such things, and it's a huge success. And he was the first in nuclear non-proliferation as a private citizen. He started up an organization called the Nuclear Threat Initiative, in which he and Senator Sam Nunn and Senator Richard Lugar, bipartisan, they went out and literally corralled loose nukes under the radar right after the fall of the Soviet Union. There were all sorts of satellite countries that had stuff, and they would go and quietly negotiate and rein them in.
Which also must make you somber, and that kind of bipartisanship, that doesn't happen anymore. Right.
Sorry?
I mean, these were Republicans and Democrats.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, and that's another thing that Ted, basically his philosophy and the DNA that we come from at CNN is the idea of talking even when you have differences, and everybody has differences, but you can't make them into World War III every time you have a difference. There has to be a place of compromise. There has to be a place of of resolution in order to move forward. And we learned that at CNN. And yes, so now it's very, very hard to watch this stuff.
Yeah. The risk of that, though, you're putting all the kinds of different voices on the program, but also CNN does have climate change deniers on the program. I've seen Santorum, a Republican congressman or former politician on the program on CNN, denying climate change happen. It doesn't happen very often, but it happens.
Yes. So,
should CNN be doing that?
No. And I don't know whether they learned their lesson, because we got roundly criticized, and we should have done. By the way, this is CNN in the United States. It's not CNN International.
Right.
I have I have simply decided on my program, I have an hour every night, and as long as I tell the truth and I don't mess around, I feel that I can do mostly what I want. And I have said that I will not have climate deniers on my program, because that is just it's not the truth, it's not even facts.
Right.
If there's this teeny weeny group of deniers, I'm not going to equate them to the massive, overwhelming fact of science. And I believe it's our existential threat at the moment, and that all of us have a duty, actually, to talk about this in a way that's now sensible and solution-oriented, and to just, the science is clear, and we have to do something about it. And actually, it's really interesting, because there's an amazing woman, and I don't know whether, anyway, you should go online and find my interview with this woman, Catherine Hayhoe. So I believe I'm not sure if she's a Republican, but she's definitely conservative, very conservative, and she is a committed Christian. And both those groups have been climate deniers, right? She also has a husband who I believe is a pastor. He's in the religious evangelical movement. And she has slowly sought to change minds in their evangelical group and amongst Christians. She talks about climate in a way that they understand, or that they need to understand. The Bible calls on all of us to protect our planet, our earth, our world. And it's a really interesting thing. And she said that, what happens is that most of the deniers, most of them are fossil fuel connected in some way, right? So they bring up this stuff that she calls, it sounds science-y, or it sounds Christian-y, or it sounds religious-y, but it's actually not. It's just a lobby group that wants to preserve their own economic interest. And when people start hearing the real story, she finds them very, very receptive. And I think that's really interesting, because what she told me about, and it's very important, because in the United States, one of the biggest and fastest growing industries is around solar panels and all this other stuff, right? It's green technology and green industry and green business. And it's really very, very fast growing. And she says that people get worried that their quality of life is going to be disintegrated. That's the thing that they worry about more. That if I can't drive my huge big truck, somehow my life is going to change. But she walks them through all these questions that they have. And that she's found is beginning to, and now the poll numbers are changing. The impression and the views of the American people are significantly changing on this issue, significantly changing. The leadership, the President of the United States, still calls it a hoax. Right. It's a problem, that. But the people are really into it. And it goes to show, I think, that movements are important.
Great, that's good news. Let's go to audience questions in a second, so everybody can think about that. But we'll go show a few photos from your career. Where is this in particular?
Okay, so this. Sorry. This is. I think this is Sarajevo or Srebrenica. Sarajevo, I think it is. Yeah, and this is now many years after the war, and it's a beautiful graveyard. When I was covering it in the early 90s, that was the main area in Sarajevo, and there was no time to put up beautiful marble headstones and marble graves. It was just dig between the shelling and the sniping, sometimes bodies going on top of each other, graves being opened, more and more people put in, just little wooden emblems. They weren't crosses because most of these are Muslim, obviously, in Sarajevo. But I remember doing one of the most poignant stories I did during the war was about a little girl called Al-Medina. And I told the story of the war and the deprivation and the siege through her headstone, which wasn't a stone, it was a piece of wood. And the city had run out of the letter A and run out of the number for the year that she died. And so it was very poignant and very emotional just to tell that story like that. And it had a big impact on a lot of people. But I remember, for me, that's what that graveyard says. I always remind myself, it reminds me of that little girl, Al-Medina, but it also reminds me of the 1984 Olympics, because just near there was the ice skating rink where Torvill and Dean skated to gold medal, to Bolero, and that ice skating rink they turned into a graveyard, the outside of it, not the inside, and the soccer fields that were around it. So that's what I see when I see that.
With all the conflicts that you've covered, what place does the Bosnian War take in your memory? Because it's been important.
Yeah, it's more than important. It's been formative for me.
How is that?
Well, it definitely, I believe it formed me as an adult. It formed me as a journalist. It formed me as a person. I will never ever, forget Bosnia, and I will never forget what I learned in Sarajevo. And I learned very, very key principles that have now I've been able to use going forward. For instance, the principle of truth first and foremost, because I got myself into this situation where people started saying, "Oh, she's siding with the Sarajevans." Right. Anyway, the long story is...
You said you were anti-Serb.
Yes.
Serbian.
Yeah. Well, I was definitely anti
right.
what they were doing.
Yeah.
And I told the story because what happened was, the truth of the story was that it was a multi-ethnic city, that everybody was intermarried, Croat, Serb, Muslim, for generations. It was the home of the Jews, after the persecution and the Inquisition. Sarajevo the National Museum has one of the oldest Haggadahs in the world. It's the most beautiful, and it was there. So it was a really, 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 really multi-ethnic, tolerant city. And for whatever reason, part of the fall of the Eastern Bloc, the Serbs, who were the powerful ones there, because it was Belgrade and Yugoslavia, they had the army, they had, the politics, and, that was the center of Yugoslavia, was in Belgrade. And so when Serbia became Serbia, it still had all the tools of the state. And they thought, well, you know what? We want a little more land, and we want to carve all this land out to just be ethnically pure white Christian Serbs. So you know how we're going to do it? We're going to besiege in a medieval fashion one of the most metropolitan cities in Europe, Sarajevo, and we're going to turn it into a medieval disaster zone. And we're going to sit, let's say, in the top rung there on the hills, and we're just going to keep bombing. And that's what they did for 4 years. Shelling, bombing, shooting, sniping. And of course we were there, and we told that story, and that story was a desperately human story. And you talked about children who were shot, women who were shot, people just going to do ordinary things that they suddenly couldn't do: collect food, collect wood because there was no heating, collect water because the water had been turned off, try to find something to make some light because there was no electricity. And they were just massacred and slaughtered. Added to that, the concentration camps, the whole scale ethnic cleansing, which now we know is genocide, because right here in The Hague, in the Netherlands, we had landmark cases, which I reported on, which have enshrined that it was a genocide. And what the problem was, world leaders didn't want to deal with it. They just didn't want to get involved. As we all know, there is a international requirement to combat genocide under the international law, and they didn't want to do it. So the more I did my stories, the more my colleagues did these stories about what was happening, trying to cleanse a territory in order to annex it. The more those who didn't want to intervene would say that we were lying, or that we were siding with one side and it wasn't fair, and oh this and oh that. So it was particularly difficult as a young journalist to figure out how to deal with that. And I ended up after being accused of being pro-whatever, I don't know what I was, pro-life, no, in this case.
Right. Pro-truth.
Pro-truth.
I think I got a scoop.
And anti-genocide. I suddenly realized that I had to make a stand. So I said, look, our golden rule is objectivity. The thing that is the golden rule for every journalist is objectivity. Now, objectivity means definitely telling all sides of the story, but it definitely does not mean drawing false equivalences, and either moral or factual. So I wasn't going to say, well, this person is equal to that person. I wasn't going to equate the victim and the aggressor. And I think that in times of this kind of issue, if you are neutral instead of truthful, you are an accomplice. You're an accomplice.
Right.
You are an accomplice, and in this case, an accomplice to genocide. And I was not going to be an accomplice to genocide. So I learned there to tell the truth, no matter how difficult it was, and no matter how unpopular it was, and that's why I found it very important.
But is there a fine line? We just saw Maduro, and you sat here and you basically said, this guy should go, which is a fair statement.
People say it's not me.
Sorry.
It's hundreds of thousands of people on the street.
Right, but you
3 million people who've run away from him.
Right, but you seem to agree with that statement.
I mean, after...
Is it something you would say on your show?
I wouldn't have said it so glibly, right? But I would have definitely, 100%. I've said it to him face to face.
Right, no, I bet, yeah.
Not that you should go, but don't you think you have a responsibility if you claim to be elected and representing the people? Yeah. No, I'm not like that. I don't fling my opinions around like that, but I do ask the pointed questions.
It's a trap for journalists, an objectivity trap, the false equivalency, you mean?
Yeah. Yeah. It's a trap, and and we should be very mindful of it. We should recognize what it is we're seeing and what it is we're covering, and cover it truthfully. And I tell you, this business of having to be neutral, I mean, that's why we're in the state we're in with climate, because journalists have mistakenly believed that they owe it to the tiny percentage of liars and deniers to equate them with the massive, overwhelming evidence of science.
But do you think, and this totally screws up my schedule, but that's fine because we're getting somewhere.
You can
I know. Let's forget about this.
Are you a good interviewer? Does.
Right. Okay. We'll forget this.
It's okay.
These are recipes. These are not really.
Now you're talking.
Are we on the winning? Yeah, I bet. But is journalism winning in a sense? I mean, if you look at what Trump does, if you look at, so the special counsel will come out with a report, maybe in a few weeks, who knows? But he has called CNN and all the others fake news for so long now. No, Trump has. Sorry, that no matter what Mueller eventually will come up with, his base won't believe it.
Right.
So you're completely right about objectivity, but is it a winning argument, or are the Bolsonaros and the Erdogans and the Orbans and the Trumps in a winning mood?
Well, I mean, you could say yes, you could, and that's a very depressing thing to say. The very depressing thing is that Duterte in Philippines, or Orban in Hungary, or, as you said, Erdogan and the others, they have no incentive to like a free press or to respect a free press. It's just not in their bones. It's not in their blood. It's not in their DNA.
Right.
You kind of expect authoritarians who are not nurtured in the democratic world.
Trump is different.
Yeah. So that's what I'm coming to. My whole career has been working in countries that are run by people who don't respect a free press. So I'm used to that, and it's dangerous physically. Many of our colleagues have been wounded, not just because they were caught in the crossfire, but because people wanted to shut them up. In Russia, in many, many places, journalists are actually targeted. The Committee to Protect Journalists, which has its own sort of statistics, every year puts out statistics with the following sober line. The leading cause amongst journalists today is deliberate murder, which, as you know, is quite skewed from the leading cause of the general population, the leading cause of death. So this is a real problem. But what's 1,000 times worse, and what compounds this problem is when the leader of the United States of America, the world's most developed democracy, says the same stuff, and therefore makes a even more permissive environment for these other non-democratic authoritarian leaders around the world. So that is a very, very big problem. And certainly the first year of Trump with the fake news thing, I think now everybody's a bit bored, you know, people just kind of fake news, okay, how many times can you say fake news? All right, we'll say it again, okay. But I think at the beginning, you know, certainly when I would go places, you know, you'd hear people just being delighted to accuse us of fake news. Well, if the President of the United States says it, it must be true. And by the way, that's true. People actually truly believe that if the President of the United States says something, he must know something.
Which should be how it is.
Yeah, it should be.
With any other president.
But I was surprised about that. You know, you always have these conspiracy theories all over the world. I thought that other leaders were using it as an excuse, but actually, many people in many parts of the world believe what comes out of the White House podium and this and that. So, are they winning? I think they have had a very good run for a couple of years, but I think the tables will turn, and I think the tables are beginning to turn. The great thing about journalism is that, and we journalists, is that we have not surrendered, and we've not bent over, and we will not take it. Yeah.
There you go. This is...
so this is Israel during the 2006 war against Hezbollah.
Right. You've been working in the Middle East, obviously, for you won't allow me to say a long time, because
yes,
that's...
no,
I know.
It's okay. I'm over
I'm looking
it now.
forward. You're over it now.
It's
okay.
okay. You can say whatever you like.
Okay.
60 and sexy.
Okay. Right. 60 is sexy. There you go. I'm almost there. So you've been covering the Middle East for about a century now. No, I'm joking. Peter Arnett, a well-known correspondent, foreign correspondent in the Vietnam War, Iran, Iraq, etc. For CNN, you must know him well. And he has said there are some stories that may be worth dying for. You just said, you know, that your perspective was changed when your son was born. Are there stories worth dying for?
But it's just too hard a question to answer, because there's just too much pain and suffering for everybody around when one of us gets hurt or one of us gets killed. I would say that subconsciously or unconsciously I probably thought that before my brain kicked in when I became a mother. But I mean, we obviously believed that in Bosnia. I mean, we were there for years and years and years under the bombing and the besiegement and the shelling and the actual targeting of journalists. You know, Bosnia was the very first war where journalists were deliberately targeted. All the others before that, whether it was Vietnam or Middle East wars or Central America and all the rest of it, journalists were caught in the crossfire, or it was accidental. Bosnia was the first time, and part of that is where they targeted us, and part of that, and now of course it's de rigueur. We are targeted, de rigueur, by state actors, by non-state actors. It's a really terrible situation.
So Bosnia was the riskiest place.
Yeah, well, it was at that time the riskiest place, right. And we stayed and we stayed and we stayed, and we lost a lot of friends, a lot of friends.
In the Middle East, where you were working there, you being a female reporter, has that, I can foresee circumstances where it's an advantage and maybe sometimes it's not. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I would say it's always an advantage.
Always?
Always. It's never been a disadvantage. Reporting while female is a route to success, in my view.
I'll think of that when my career evolves from here.
Well, you know, we live in a very fluid world.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
Doctors can do a lot.
Seriously?
Yes.
Seriously. Okay, so I never thought there was something weird about being a woman, or that I was ever at any disadvantage. Now, call me crazy, call my parents brilliant, but I was raised never to have thought that there was anything unavailable to me because I was a woman. So I thank my parents and my family for just that, without ever indoctrinating me. It was just I was never told I can't do something because I'm a girl. But
not everybody you run into was raised by your parents.
No, but who gave a crap about them? I was doing my stuff, right. And it was great. And I came up at a time when it was, the first Gulf War was when I first did my first big story, and I got a lot of publicity and attention because I was a woman. But that's when it became more and more visible, more and more women, and behind the scenes, in front of the scenes, everything. I think the big issue right now is that there are not enough women running news organizations. In fact, there aren't any women running any news organizations as far as I can gather, except for at CBS News now, the great Susan Zirinsky has been made president of the network, which is fantastic.
And is that obviously it's a problem, but do you also see it in programming? Is that what you mean?
No, because you see many women fronting programs. I think on the air there's
choosing items, topics, whatever.
I mean, I just think that I mean, look, the world is made up of 50% women and 50% men, and when men have 100% of the power, there's a problem. I mean, it's a skewed
look what
view.
Happened, right?
Yeah.
So it's always, you're saying it's always been an advantage, and
yes, it has been for me
in making first contact with people,
yes,
or
first
anything.
contact with people. I think probably because we do live in a patriarchal world still, so that often men will maybe think that they were not getting such a hard, deal when they saw a woman or whatever, or they would open the door for a woman. They're just usually nice to women,
right?
Usually,
right? Usually. Yeah.
If they're not nice, you know what I mean?
Exactly.
So for me, it was like, okay, well, they're letting me go. They're opening the door. I'll put my foot in the door, and I won't take it out. And that's what happened. That is
You've been traveling, I read, with all female crews.
As well, yeah. Actually, you're right. In some areas, let's say in the Muslim world or whatever, you can't actually go into the women's part of the home or whatever if you're a guy. So in that regard, being a woman was actually substantively advantageous.
Okay,
yeah.
Great. Let's go to the next photo, which is the Haiti earthquake in 2010, I believe. Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah, this is Haiti. Now, there were so many journalists there on the ground. That's
my old mate, David Rust. He's a great, great cameraman, and he's a great hoarder.
What does he hoard?
He could fill this theater and make a museum of all the things that he's collected from all the war zones, all the places we've been together. It would be the most brilliant CNN museum. Phenomenal. Phenomenal.
So you've traveled with him to many places?
Yes, since 1992.
Right.
Yeah.
How important is that, by the way? I mean, traveling with your own crew.
It's great, actually. It's really great. We don't always do that. I mean, there's a big pool of people, but sometimes in some circumstances, we end up being the same people working together. And actually, it does. It's like a cohesive unit of brothers and sisters in service of the same end.
Now, the Haiti earthquake in 2010, which I covered myself, and there were hundreds of journalists there. Yeah. And being CNN, you have to go live all the time. How do you pick your story? How do you realize this is what I want to focus on?
It's difficult. It's difficult and it's not difficult. I mean, in a place like Haiti, I mean, you were there. Every time you step out of your bedroom, there's another story, because there's so much need, there's so much catastrophe that I found Haiti actually, in terms of telling stories, just like Bosnia, there was just so much to tell. You never had to search for what to tell. And again, for me, telling the story is always trying to get to the human angle of the story. Because, of course, before I really came into the studio, I didn't really do a whole lot of top-level interviewing.
Right.
And I really was very, very concerned with the actors in the field, on the ground, whether it's war or famine or whatever it is.
What made you change your mind then? Because I remember, because that's when I was a correspondent in Washington, you went to ABC. You started hosting This Week, which is a sort of a Sunday morning political talk show. We have it here.
Yeah.
And that took me by surprise because I've been watching you in conflict zones, and there you were in a Washington studio. It didn't last very long. I think an hour and a half would be really short. I think it took a year and a half.
Yeah, that was another of my
That didn't seem like your habitat.
No, it wasn't my habitat. Here's the thing. I said, you need a little failure in order to really do well.
That was it.
This was another of my big failures.
Why did you say yes?
Because I wanted to do something new, and I think I was a bit pissed off at the time, truth be told, at CNN, and
Why?
I'm not going to tell you why.
You brought it up. Why?
No,
just give me something.
No.
Salary, colleagues?
No, never salary. It was, to be honest with you, look, I'm not going to tell you why, but I'm going to tell you that it's why-ish. There's something quite necessary sometimes about being vulnerable and about having the confidence and the vulnerability to try something new. And that's what I did. Basically, I applied for the job that was suddenly open at ABC, but the truth of the matter is I had been assured that, in long conversations, it took a long time for this negotiation, mostly over the substance. And I really wanted to bring the world into America. So this was 2010. Now it's sort of matter of course, it's happening. And now I do a show on PBS, which is the show I wanted to do on ABC, basically.
But with international guests.
Yeah, international and American.
Right.
I wanted to do a mix of international and American for a global and a US audience. And I think I was just ahead of my time, what can I tell you? But it did really badly, and I basically got kicked off.
Right.
What can I tell you? And I went back to CNN.
How do you feel about politicians?
Ooh, that's a bit of a leading question.
No, I know, but it doesn't sound like your favorite breed.
No,
I mean, it's not my favorite breed.
No, that's not true. In fact, what I think is a real problem is the lack of respect amongst society that politicians have these days. It's politicians, it's journalists, it's, I don't know, we're all really right at the bottom of the pile of popularity. I think that's a problem. I think it's a problem. Right. And I think we have a duty, I think, not to just piss all over any politician just for the hell of it.
No. But you've seen the House of Commons, you've seen Brexit, you called Congress dysfunctional. Some deserve it.
That's today, now. But it doesn't mean to say it's all the time.
No, of course not, and not everyone.
And you've got to be able to look for those who are prepared to break with their party or to reach across the aisle. And I really try to promote and interview those people because I think it's really interesting and it's mature but I think what I think is really sad is how in the democratic world, in the free world, the number of young people who vote, is just not high enough. And I think it's getting higher. I think in response to these cataclysmic political developments we've had since Brexit, the whole 2016 to 2019 has been a particular moment in history.
Yeah. And the midterms could make you optimistic when it comes to turnout.
That's right. But I think that if we're going to treat politicians like criminals, then we're not going to get good politicians and we're not going to get good policies. So I actually think it's a much more nuanced relationship that the press should have with politicians and with politics. Of course we have to hold everybody accountable, but we also have to report on the good stuff and the success. If we constantly just report the bad stuff, it's not just that it's just a one-note Johnny. We are contributing to the cynicism in society, to the lack of hope in society. And I genuinely believe that one of the big problems is a lack of hope and a lack of belief in the future. Because I think we humans, without hope, we're nothing. And I really, really do strongly, that's a huge part of my broadcasting and my reporting I'm looking for the hope, I'm looking for the reconciliation, I'm looking for the tolerance, I'm looking for the brave new policies. And that's what I want to focus on.
Great. Let's go to the next photo.
Oh yeah. Everybody's favorite.
Why is that?
Because he's a teddy bear. He's so nice. He's so nice. He's so nice and so funny. And I've interviewed him several times.
He never leaves.
He never leaves?
No, I mean he's been there forever.
Yeah. Well, touch wood.
No, I know.
He's old,
Right.
but he's very, very funny, and he's very nice. And this was, I was doing a documentary called, actually, I'd done God's Warriors, which was a sort of emblematic series on CNN, and then this was going to be, I can't remember, but this was about Buddhists. So I was looking into the Buddhist faith. And he was just a really nice guy, and he's very funny, and I had to make him up, and he was hilarious about that. Mm-hmm. And I actually use a picture on my program now where he's touching my face, and he's so sweet, and he's so human. Nice guy.
The art of the interview. What makes a good interview?
Well,
for
you said it. I thought you actually summed it up pretty well. I hadn't really thought about it in those terms, but it is the ability to weave ruthlessness and empathy in a way that works. And I think you're absolutely right. An interview that is just relentlessly aggressive, where you're constantly interrupting, and you just think you want to hear yourself and blah blah blah, is not an interview. It's a boxing match, and so I think that a good interview is as you described it, and I'm going to take that away and think about it.
Is there? Right. That's why I'm here, to teach you about.
To remind me.
About interviewing.
One's always a student.
I know.
Never too old to be a student.
What's the interview you've always wanted but never got?
God. All right.
No, but there must be one in particular.
Yes, there are. There are three.
We can make this a very therapeutical thing if you want.
Can you get me Kim Jong-un? That wouldn't be empathetic.
What would be what would be your key question to him?
I don't know. I have to think about it.
I understand.
The Queen of England, not going to happen. And the Pope.
That's of those three. That sounds like the most.
I don't think so.
Doable? No.
Not happening.
Okay. Have you tried to interview Donald Trump?
Yes. Many times. I even thought I was really close a couple of times, but it ended up that I wasn't.
Because I'm one. This always happens.
Do you know what? I have never interviewed a sitting United States president. Never. Zero. Nada.
You could take that.
Not even President Obama.
You could take that as a compliment.
I do.
Right. Okay. Good.
And I'm going to.
Right. No, I'm mentioning Trump because I'm thinking. Would it be even worth interviewing him if you know that whatever your question is, the answer will be something completely different? If he just goes off and throws stuff at you which isn't even remotely true, why bother?
I still would do it.
We have a surprise.
I would try to do it differently.
Everybody tried to do it differently.
But I would try.
What would you try?
I don't know yet. I'd have to figure it out.
Okay, I'll ask you this again at the end.
Game plan it.
Game plan it, yeah, exactly.
You do actually, by the way. I have done interviews, not many because this bit takes a huge amount of work, and it's only for certain personalities that you need to do it. But I've literally spent a long time on the floor of my office with all sorts of clippings and cards and putting them here, there and everywhere and trying to sort of design the interview in my head and getting quotes and knowing that I'm going to say this to them and that to them and read them this back or this soundbite from somebody. It's just to choreograph and arrange the interview. And I did that once to, I can't remember who it was, but it really worked actually. It was really interesting. I did that with the first reform president of Iran, Mohammad Khatami. I really prepared a lot for that. And it was a mega interview. I mean, it went all over the world. It was really a serious interview because he had never talked before. Because
you were prepared for every answer.
And I was prepared with stuff and how to ask stuff and not just how do you feel about this, but how to put it in a way that I would actually get an answer rather than just a monosyllabic yes or no.
Because is that the most important thing also, to get something newsworthy out of an interview?
Not just newsworthy, but an answer. Right. And that's another problem. And I'm guilty of this sometimes too, by the way, of talking too much and of not letting them talk more. Or letting them talk, but but there's too much preamble.
What's the interview you're most proud of?
Well, I love that Khatami interview because it really changed the dynamic between Iran and the rest of the world. First, he apologized for the hostage crisis. Never had an Iranian president done that before. He spoke about domestic reforms in a way that, I mean, you know, he could have been a social democrat from I don't know where. Do you know what I mean? It was really remarkable. He reached out to Saudi Arabia and other places. In the diplomats told me this was the manifesto for the next, for his term. And it really made a difference. The world looked at Iran in a very different way after that interview and during his tenure.
I want to talk a little bit more, we have about 10, 15 more minutes, about covering Trump, realizing that you, from London you don't cover Trump as much as you would if you were living in Washington. But you just said about 15 minutes ago, don't play Trump's game. And when I look at the domestic CNN, I sometimes get the feeling that, you know, don't wrestle with a pig. The pig likes it and you get dirty. And CNN sometimes gets dirty. It's if you see the White House correspondent, there seems to be some emotions in it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, well, you know, somebody much more important than myself, Bob Woodward, said, you know, he just wrote the big book about Trump, and it was, as usual, really interesting, and he always gets everybody to talk to him. He said, you know, journalists are just too emotional in the way they're dealing with Trump. You know, it's true, but on the other hand, he provokes us. You know, it's a typical dysfunctional relationship. I mean, there's so much you could write about psychologically about this. And people think it's just, you know, rubbish armchair psychology, but it's really important for people to understand that there's something desperately wrong with this relationship, and there are all sorts of personal and psychological reasons for it.
But he wants Jim Acosta to take the bait, and Jim Acosta takes the bait.
Yeah, well, his problem is Trump, I can't remember whether I said this, so tell me if I'm repeating myself. But at the very first press conference that he gave, which was right after his election and before the inauguration in Trump Tower, he suddenly swung round at CNN, and it was Jim Acosta, and that's when he first said, "You are fake news." That's when he first said it. So it was November 2016, and he's just continued this war against CNN ever since. So CNN feels that it has to defend itself, defend the truth, and keep standing up. And it, you know, sometimes it's goes overboard a little bit, but what can I tell you? It's an unusual situation.
Now, Bob Woodward, you just mentioned him, and I have a quote here that I want to read. He said that this last week to the New York Times. The reason why he gave an interview was there was a big story last week by BuzzFeed News. Yeah. BuzzFeed News had this blockbuster story saying that Donald Trump, and it's a very respected news organization, particularly on this topic, it said that Donald Trump ordered his lawyer, Michael Cohen, to lie to Congress. No other outlet, including CNN, has backed that up. It was the first time that the special counsel in the Russia investigation responded, saying this story is not true. And Bob Woodward said, I am thankful I don't have to cover this Trump-Russia story on a daily basis. The hydraulic pressure in the system is just too great, and the impatience of the internet, you know, give it to us immediately, drives so much, it's hard to sort something like this out.
I think he's right. You know, it is too much. Even I'm a little bit sort of, you know, I don't want to cover it every single day. And I don't want to be saying things like that if I can't be rock solid about that. That's a really serious accusation. They still stand by it, to be fair to BuzzFeed. But I think it's become, you know, of course, Bob is the guy who did Watergate. So he had his own massive hydraulic pressure going on, but it was in a different era. Right. And you could actually go and get your sources and talk to your sources, and you could get the time from your editor to make sure, and he talks about this a lot, him and Bernstein, to make sure they were absolutely rock solid before they put anything in the Washington Post. Right. And so, you know, yes, there are these real crazy pressures out there right now.
But it also means that since mistakes obviously have been made by the media, it happens, you know, to everybody in this Trump-Russia investigation, having a president like this who jumps on every mistake also must make you, you know, double check your sources more and more. I mean, in a way it's good, I guess.
For us it definitely does. But I would also say one of the horrible side effects of this dysfunctional relationship right now, and the lies and the lies and the lies that come out of the White House, is that the speed of social media and the speed with which, you know, a story is breaking news 1 minute and it's gone the next minute and another story is breaking news. The problem is that a lot of these stories come and go. So I don't know how many, to the point of the other gentleman there, you know, how do you keep the spotlight on all the time? You don't. These stories have a half-life that are even more rapid than they've ever been. So, I mean, in a week that won't even be important. Something else will have happened.
I guess it's hard to speculate about how this presidency will evolve or end, but we'll do so anyway, since we seem to be in the final stages of this Russia investigation, whether it's weeks or months, or what are your expectations of this?
I don't know. I don't know whether it's going to be a criminal enterprise or a national security enterprise. I don't know whether it's something that's going to be about, you know, money, or is it something, you know, intelligence-wise? I don't know, and I don't know what it'll mean anyway. What the Congress will do. I think that if anything was to happen, it would have to have a majority of his own party to agree. Obviously, in the House now that there's the majority, but I think it's interesting that Nancy Pelosi has said that, you know, the idea of impeachment is not the thing that she's going to go for, unless it becomes, unless there's something massive. In other words, that's not where she's going to start her leadership of the House. So I think that's interesting. I think, to be honest with you, given that we're sitting here talking in Europe, I think one of the most troubling things about the Trump presidency is now that you can see it 2 years on, the systematic degradation and degrading of allies and alliances, and, you know, treating European colleagues and friends and allies as if they were adversaries and competitors, the consistent threats to pull out of things like NATO or whatever it might. He's already done the climate. He's already done the Iran nuclear deal. I think that, that's a real problem. I also believe that, and I don't know how, you know, it's hard to get leaders to actually be honest when you're asking them. I've asked several European leaders, what do they think now that Mattis has gone, the last adult standing, the last, you know,
Secretary of Defense.
The Secretary of Defense who resigned over the Syria policy. So it's a bit worrying to think that now President Trump has all like-minded senior cabinet members and nobody who will push back on big foreign issues that I'm concerned about. And then I get worried about things like, you know, policy by tweet, so pulling out of Syria. So, you know, there's a lot to worry about, frankly.
I want to end with a question about Europe, but that also brings me back to, we talked about the Bosnian War being one of the key moments in your career, maybe the key moment. It cemented your reputation. This thing happened only 40 years after World War II in Europe. For many of us, I guess it also underlined the need for a strong European Union. This should never happen again. Do these things, and maybe also the danger of nationalism, is this in the back of your mind when you're in the field reporting all the time? Because it seems that way.
Now. I mean, it's the motif and the backdrop for what we're reporting right now. Yeah, this ugly rise of populism, nationalism, which is all centered, a lot of it centered around hatred of foreigners. I think Europe, to be honest with you, failed on the great challenge of our time, which was the immigration crisis. And Europe did not...
The recent one, you mean?
From 2015.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. I think that if Europe had been more willing to take their fair share and not letting all of them go to Germany or all of them try to come through Hungary and all that kind of stuff, I think maybe, you know, this continent of 500 million people could have absorbed 1 million and nobody would have been any the wiser. But because it became such a fight, because it became such a thing, it destabilized so many countries, and it made craven politicians able to use that as a way to, you know, to give rise to their populist politics. So I regret that. I regret that Europe wasn't able to deal with that properly. And then, of course, we're still suffering the effects of austerity in so many areas. And you know, that's real people really hurting.
And if we end with an optimistic note.
Mm-hmm. Despite all of this.
Exactly.
Well, look, I think, as I say, I believe 2018 was one of the most difficult years in modern, certainly in my career, I mean politically and in every way, because it really did seem like the world was on the verge of a nervous breakdown and nobody quite knew how to deal with all this turbulence. I think it's sort of, to an extent, calming down. I think also where I get hope is from a backlash. I get hope from, let's just talk about the United States of America, where we've had another election. So it's the only real place we can look at. The midterms were very, very indicative of people who decided that they could no longer sit on their couches and let the world go by. They got up, they voted, made a difference. Of movements, whether it's on climate inside the United States, even if the government doesn't believe it, whether it's against guns, whether it's against racial inequality, whether it's for women's rights. I think that has been one of the most important reactions to this reactionary force that we've been seeing. And I also think journalism has stood up. You know, people have been talking about the demise of journalism since time immemorial. And yet, in these last 2 years, journalists have really stood up and they've told and broken incredible news, they've held people accountable, and we are getting more and more readers and listeners and viewers, and whatever, users. So I think that's great. For me, that's great. And I think the one thing I've learned, which maybe I didn't know, I thought that history went in a nice progressive line, but I realized that it doesn't. It's just circular. Mm-hmm. It's just circular. So if we can get through this, you know, there is light at the end of the tunnel.
Perfect.